Bracelet that shook the ballroom. The Whitaker estate glimmered like a palace under 1,000 lights that evening, its marble floors reflecting the glow of crystal chandeliers and golden sconces that lined the high-ceilinged ballroom. The occasion was one of those nights society never failed to talk about: a fundraising gala, where the city's wealthiest families, celebrities, and politicians mingled under the illusion of charity, sipping champagne and trading promises disguised as conversations. Waiters glided silently across the room, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and expensive wine, and the orchestra's music painted an elegant background to laughter, ambition, and carefully curated reputations. For most of the guests, it was a night of prestige, a night to be seen. But for Maya William, dressed in the plain black and white uniform of the service staff, it was a night of labor, of bowing her head and moving through shadows, careful not to draw notice. Yet fate had a different plan, and it began with the bracelet that glimmered faintly on her wrist, a bracelet that would unravel decades of silence, power, and secrets. Maya had worn it without thought, as she always did. It was one of the few possessions she carried from her late childhood, passed to her by her mother Elise, a frail woman who had lived her life battling poverty and illness with dignity that the world rarely respected. The bracelet was silver, simple in design, yet with a delicate engraving that looked almost like a compass etched into its curve. To Maya, it was only a memory of love, a reminder of her mother's strength, a talisman she clung to through nights when hunger gnawed and hope faltered. She never imagined it could matter to anyone else, much less to the billionaire who owned the mansion in which she now worked. Yet across the ballroom, Thomas Whitaker's gaze had locked onto her wrist the moment she bent to refill a guest's glass, and the sight struck him like a ghost walking out of memory. Thomas Whitaker had built an empire with hands that once sketched dreams and designs, but over time those same hands had signed contracts, crushed rivals, and amassed fortunes that made him both feared and admired. He was the type of man who could silence a boardroom with a raised eyebrow, whose presence filled spaces even when he said nothing at all. Yet tonight, for the first time in decades, his composure cracked. He had been seated with his wife, Cassandra, and their son, Edward, engaging in stiff conversations with politicians and investors, when his eyes fell upon the young maid and the impossible sight of the bracelet. His breath had caught, his fingers stiffened around the stem of his wineglass, and for a moment the bustling room blurred around him. Memories rushed back, memories of a woman with dark skin, laughter like music, and eyes that had once been his entire world. He remembered the nights he spent whispering promises to her, the foolish sketches he made on scraps of paper, and how one of those sketches became the bracelet he gave her, saying it was a compass that would always guide them back together. There had been only one. He had crafted it with his own hands, poured his soul into it. And now it was here, on the wrist of a maid. The orchestra's violin soared, but Thomas's voice cut sharper than the music. "Maya, that bracelet, where? Did you get it?" The question broke the rhythm of the evening like a hammer shattering glass. Guests froze mid-conversation, glasses trembled in hands. The hum of chatter dissipated into a silence so tense it seemed the very chandeliers leaned forward to listen. Maya stiffened, her tray balanced in her hands, her face heating as 100. Eyes turned toward her. She hadn't even realized he knew her name, much less that he would address her in front of everyone. Her heart thundered in her chest, the sound roaring in her ears as she forced her lips to part. It was my mother's," she managed, her voice soft but steady. "She gave it to me years ago. She said it was a gift from someone who once meant everything to her." The words slipped into the silence like stones cast into a still lake, their ripples spreading through every corner of the ballroom. Gasps followed, whispers rising like smoke, guests leaning toward one another with hungry curiosity. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight behind them, the suggestion that something hidden had been thrust into the light. Thomas's eyes widened, his chest tightening with grief and recognition. But before he could utter another word, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "You filthy liar." Cassandra Whitaker stepped forward, her emerald gown swirling like a blade unsheathed. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing the venom in her stride. She stood inches from Maya, her expression twisted with disdain. You dare stand here weaving stories, pretending that trinket has any meaning? You think you can trap an old man with some pathetic tale? Her words dripped with cruelty, each syllable calculated to wound. She leaned closer, her breath hot and poisonous. I've seen women like you my entire life, black maids with hungry eyes, clinging to scraps of opportunity, pathetic, you. Disgust me, her hand lashed out before Maya could react. A sharp crack echoed as the tray fell, glasses shattering against the marble floor in a glittering storm. Maya's cheek burned from the slap, her body trembling though she willed herself. Not to cry? The entire room gasped, some with shock, others with morbid delight at the scandal unraveling before them. For a heartbeat, Thomas seemed to grow 10 feet tall, his voice booming across the silence. Cassandra! The command silenced the room further, his tone filled with a mixture of grief and fury. Yet as quickly as the fire rose in him, it dimmed. To sorrow, his eyes, shadowed by decades of regrets, fell to the ground. This isn't the place, he muttered. Though the damage had already been done, music stumbled, then resumed too bright, too false, a mask for a wound that could not be hidden. Maya steadied herself, swallowing the sting in her cheek, her pride forcing her to bend down and collect the shards of glass with shaking hands. No tears, she told herself. Not here. Not in front of them? With her dignity fractured. But unbroken, she slipped into the service corridor, the heavy door closing behind her with a final, merciless click. In the ballroom, conversations reignited, sharper now, charged with speculation. The name Whitaker would echo in tomorrow's papers, but for tonight, it was enough for gossip to bloom like wildfire. Hours later, long after the chandeliers dimmed and the last limousine departed, Thomas found himself wandering through the back corridors of his estate, his polished shoes echoing against stone walls seldom touched by his presence. He followed the faint sound of running water until he reached the loading dock, where the night smelled of detergent, rain, and exhaustion. There he saw her, Maya, her hands red from scrubbing trays, her face still flushed from the humiliation she had endured. For a long moment he simply watched, his throat tightening. The sight of her bent shoulders, the stubborn way she worked, even through pain, reminded him of someone he had loved and lost. Maya, he said at last, his voice smaller than it had been in years. She froze, her hand tightening around the sponge, then slowly turned. Her eyes were wary, guarded, yet steady as they met his. Please, he whispered, his gaze falling to the bracelet again. Tell me where you got that bracelet. His words trembled, carrying not authority but desperation. As though the answer was the only thread keeping his past from unraveling, Maya's hand closed protectively over her wrist. Her jaw clenched, but her voice was firm. My family is. Not your stage, Mr. Whitaker, not your entertainment. With respect, you don't get to interrogate me. I'm the only paycheck in my house. I can't afford trouble. I can't afford to lose my job because the richest man in the room thinks I look like his past. Her eyes burned with quiet defiance, and in that moment Thomas saw not a maid, not a servant, but a spirit forged by hardship and dignity. He flinched, her words piercing deeper than any insult. Your family, he asked softly. Do you have anyone? Your mother? Maya's voice cut in, crisp as the night air. My family is my business. Then she turned, her footsteps echoing as the heavy door closed behind her, leaving him in silence with the weight of memories pressing against his chest. Inside the grand mansion, the real danger stirred. Edward Whitaker, Thomas's son, poured himself a drink in the study as Cassandra paced like a predator. Her emerald gown now rumpled, her face still sharp with fury, she turned to him with eyes that gleamed like steel. If that girl really has something to do with your father, she spat, her voice dripping with venom, she's a threat. You know what that means? Edward's jaw tightened, his knuckles white around the glass. I won't let anyone touch what's ours, if it comes to it. His words trailed into silence, but the implication hung heavy between them. Cassandra raised her glass, her lips curving into a cruel smile. Then we'll make sure she and her sick mother disappear from the picture permanently. They clinked their glasses, sealing a quiet pact of fear and greed. While elsewhere in the mansion, Thomas sat alone in his library, staring at the fire that refused to warm him. He could not unsee the bracelet. He could not silence the memory of the woman he had once loved, the woman he had betrayed. And in that haunting moment, he understood. The truth he had buried was no longer willing to stay hidden. Whispers of the past. The city outside the glittering Whitaker estate lived a very different rhythm. While chandeliers still swayed with the memory of champagne and music in the grand ballroom, Maya returned to her world of cracked pavements, flickering street lamps, and the faded wallpaper of an apartment that smelled of medicine more than comfort. The moment she closed the thin wooden door behind her, the weight of the evening's humiliation pressed into her chest. She leaned against the door, clutching her wrist as if the bracelet itself burned her. The sting of Cassandra's slap still pulsed across her cheek, but it was the sting of memory, shame, and fear that hurt most. She had faced wealthy cruelty before, snide remarks, dismissive stares, the way people like Cassandra looked at her as though she were less than human. But this time it was different. This time her name had been spoken by Thomas Whitaker himself. This time the bracelet had turned her from invisible servant into a target, under the sharpest gaze of power. In the small bedroom, her mother Elise stirred at the sound of the door. Elise had grown thinner in recent months, her body wasting under the grip of illness that seemed to drain more life each day. Yet her eyes, though lined with exhaustion, still glowed with that rare mixture of gentleness and fire that Maya had inherited. She pushed herself up on trembling elbows, the oxygen concentrator humming faintly at her side. "You're late, sweetheart," Elise whispered, her voice rasping but warm. Maya hurried to her bedside, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The gala ran long," she said softly. She tried to hide her cheek with her hair, but Elise saw everything. A mother's eyes miss nothing. Her frail hand reached out, touching Maya's face with trembling fingers. "Someone hurt you," Elise said, her voice trembling between sorrow and anger. Maya swallowed hard, blinking back the tears she had refused to show in that ballroom. "It doesn't matter. I just need to hold it together for us, that's what matters." Elise's gaze drifted downward, landing on the silver bracelet that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Her fingers brushed against it as though it carried a memory too heavy to speak aloud. "That bracelet," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "I should have known it would one day bring him back to us." Maya stiffened, her throat tightening. She had heard fragments, whispers from her mother in half-asleep moments about love, betrayal, and a man who had chosen ambition over heart. But never had her mother said his name, never had she described the full truth. Tonight, after Thomas's gaze had pierced her soul in that ballroom, Maya knew without question that the story her mother carried was bound to him. "Who was he?" Maya asked softly, her voice trembling as though afraid of the answer. Elise's lips parted, but she hesitated. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the machine. "Someone who made promises," she said finally, "and then broke them. Someone who loved me once, but chose the world instead." While mother and daughter clung to their fragile haven of truth, far across town the Whitaker mansion simmered with tension. Edward poured himself another drink, the amber liquid catching the flicker of the fireplace. His jaw was clenched, his mind restless with the memory of his father's eyes fixed on that maid, on her bracelet, on a truth that threatened everything he had worked for. Cassandra paced the room like a caged predator, her crimson lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you see what's happening?" she hissed, her voice sharp as broken glass. "He's obsessed. That bracelet, that girl, he's not letting this go. If she is what I think she is, then everything we've built, everything you're positioned to inherit, it all falls apart." Edward's hand tightened around the glass until it threatened to shatter. He had spent years clawing his way into his father's shadow, proving himself as heir to the empire, carrying the Whitaker name with ruthless ambition. The idea of losing it all to a servant girl, worse, a maid of color, was unbearable to him. "She's nothing," Edward muttered through clenched teeth. "She's a nobody, but father, he believes what he wants to believe. And if he starts?" Digging into the past, his words trailed off, but Cassandra finished them with a cruel smile. Then we make sure he never finds what he's looking for. We cut the roots before they sprout. That night, Thomas Whitaker sat alone in his private library, the firelight flickering against oak-paneled walls lined with books that smelled of age and forgotten wisdom. But he did not see the books, nor the fire. His eyes were lost in the past, fixed on the image of a woman he had once loved with the full force of his youth, Elise. Her name still lived in the chambers of his memory, though he had tried to bury it beneath contracts, headlines, and a marriage that had never touched his soul. He remembered the nights in their small apartment decades ago, when he still dreamed of art and freedom before money twisted him into steel. He remembered sketching designs in the glow of a cheap lamp, Elise laughing as she leaned over his shoulder, her hand tracing the lines. And he remembered the night he presented her with the bracelet, telling her it was a compass, that no matter how far life pulled them apart, it would guide them back. He had believed those words when he spoke them. Yet in the end, when ambition came knocking, he left her with nothing but that compass and a hollow promise. Now, seeing it on Maya's wrist, the weight of his betrayal pressed against his chest like a stone he could not breathe around. Could it be? Could she truly be his daughter? His heart said yes. His mind recoiled in fear. The following days blurred into a haze of whispers. In the corridors of high society, rumors circulated like wildfire about the Maid, the Bracelet, the strange scene at the gala. Some dismissed it as scandalous nonsense. Others whispered with eager hunger, speculating about mistresses and illegitimate children, about the cracks forming in the Whitaker legacy. Newspapers had not yet printed the story, but it was only a matter of time before someone decided the tale was too delicious to ignore. Cassandra worked tirelessly to fan the whispers in ways that served her purpose, feeding subtle hints to acquaintances, twisting the story to paint Maya as manipulative, a liar grasping for fortune. Edward, meanwhile, buried himself in strategy, convincing himself that his father's obsession would pass, that with enough pressure, Maya would disappear back into obscurity. Yet deep down, fear gnawed at him. He had seen the look in his father's eyes. It was not the look of a man toying with a servant. It was the look of a man haunted by truth. Maya, however, carried her burdens silently. She still worked her shifts, still moved through the mansion's corridors with the quiet grace of someone who knew the price of drawing attention. But everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her, some curious, some judgmental, some hostile. The other staff whispered, unsure whether to envy or pity her. Some avoided her altogether, fearful of being caught in whatever storm loomed over her. Yet when she returned home each night, she became again simply a daughter, sitting at her mother's bedside, feeding her soup, brushing damp towels across her fevered forehead. "I don't want his money," Maya said one evening, her voice heavy as she adjusted Elise's blankets. "I don't want anything from him. I've worked too hard to let anyone treat me like a beggar." Elise's hand reached out, frail, but insistent, pulling Maya closer. "Child," she whispered, "sometimes it isn't about what you want. It's about truth. You deserve to know who you are. And he deserves to face what he did. Running from it only lets others write your story for you." Those words echoed in Maya's chest long into the night as she lay awake listening to the hum of the machine beside her mother's bed. She hated the thought of opening doors better left closed, yet something in her mother's tone told her it was inevitable. Across town, Thomas lay awake in his vast bed, the sheets cold and unwelcoming, despite their luxury. He stared at the ceiling, tormented by the ghosts of memory. His wife, Cassandra, lay beside him, her back turned, her breaths shallow with feigned sleep. He thought not of her, but of Elise, of the daughter who might be his blood, of the bracelet he once made with hands that believed in love instead of greed. The empire he had built seemed suddenly fragile, hollow, incapable of shielding him from the regret clawing at his soul. For the first time in years, he longed not for power, but for redemption. Bloodlines in shadows, the following week unfolded under a veil of unease that clung to the Whitaker estate like a restless spirit. The gala incident had not yet reached the newspapers, but the whispers were louder now. echoing in the polished marble corridors and slithering through the conversations of business partners and political allies. Wherever Thomas Whitaker went, people watched him more closely, studying his silences as much as his words. He, however, cared little for their speculations. His heart was elsewhere, haunted by the young maid's eyes, by the tremble in her voice when she said the bracelet belonged to her mother, and by the memories of a woman he had once loved with all the foolish courage of youth. He could not concentrate on the board's figures or the upcoming contracts. He found himself instead staring into the fire of his library, clutching the memory of Elise, the woman who had carried his love only to be abandoned when ambition pulled him into a different world. And now, if Maya was truly her daughter, if she was truly his daughter, then the years of silence had not only cost him Elise, but a family he had never dared to claim. It was with this torment that Thomas finally decided he could no longer wait for coincidence or whispers. He had to know the truth from the only person who could give it to him. So one evening, dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in a simpler coat that seemed to weigh more than his shoulders could bear, he stepped into a black car and gave his driver an address he had not spoken aloud in decades. The city blurred past him, neon lights and shadows melding into a haze as he gripped his cane tighter than necessary, his heart thundering with the anticipation of old wounds. The car finally slowed before a worn-down apartment building, its bricks weathered, its windows clouded with age. Thomas dismissed the driver and climbed the cracked steps alone, each one groaning as if in protest to his intrusion. By the time he knocked on the thin wooden door, his throat was dry, his breath shallow. And when it opened, revealing Maya's wary eyes, his chest clenched. She looked at him as though he were an unwelcome ghost standing at her threshold, yet behind her he glimpsed a frail figure propped against pillows, a face he had not seen in nearly 30 years. Elise. For a long moment, no one moved. The hum of the oxygen concentrator filled the silence, a low reminder of life clinging on in fragile balance. Elise blinked, her lips parting, her breath catching at the sight of the man she had once loved, the man she had once hated, the man she had never truly forgotten. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling between disbelief and sorrow. The sound of his name from her lips undid him. His cane nearly slipped from his hand as he stepped inside, eyes shimmering with tears. He had not allowed himself in decades. "Elise," he managed, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve to be here, but I had to see you. I had to know." Maya's eyes darted between them, confusion and anger battling inside her chest. She wanted to slam the door, to protect her mother from the pain this man represented, but Elise lifted a trembling hand and gestured for him to come closer. "Let him in, Maya," she whispered. "There are truths that cannot wait forever." Thomas crossed the small apartment, his polished shoes foreign against the threadbare carpet, his figure towering yet strangely diminished as he sank onto the chair beside Elise's bed. He reached for her hand with hesitation, his fingers trembling, as though touching a relic he had lost. "I failed you," he said, his voice low and ragged. "I chose the world over you, and I've carried that weight ever since. But now, this bracelet, Maya." His eyes flicked toward the young woman standing rigid near the door. "Tell me, Elise, please, is she—" The silence that followed was unbearable. Elise's eyes, though clouded with illness, were sharp, with memory. She studied him, studied Maya, studied the years that hung between them like an unspoken sentence. Finally, with a frail but steady voice, she said, "Yes, she is your blood, Thomas. She is the piece of you the world could never erase. You don't need a test to prove what your heart already knows." The words pierced through him like a blade, and yet healed him in the same breath. His chest caved, his vision blurred, and tears slipped freely down his cheeks before he could stop them. He turned toward Maya, who stood frozen, her face pale, her jaw clenched as though bracing herself for a storm. "Maya," he whispered, his voice raw, "you are my daughter." The words hung in the air like thunder. Maya's throat tightened, her eyes burning with anger and disbelief. She shook her head, her voice brittle with years of suppressed pain. "Don't call me that. I grew up without a father. She was all I had. And now she's dying, and you think you can just appear, call me your daughter, and make everything right? Where were you when we were hungry? When she worked herself sick? When I scrubbed floors just to keep the lights on? You abandoned us. Each word struck him harder than any business defeat, harder than any financial loss. He reached toward her, but she stepped back, her arms folded across her chest like armor. For a moment, Thomas wanted to plead, to argue, but Elise's frail voice stopped him. She has every right to feel this way, Thomas. You chose ambition. You chose Cassandra. You left us behind, but the truth remains. She is your child. The weight of her words shattered what remained of his defenses. He bowed his head, gripping Elise's blanket as though it were the last thread tying him to the man he once had been. Then let me spend what remains of my life making it right, he whispered, his voice trembling. Not with promises of, the world I know better than that, just with presence. Just by standing beside her, beside you, if you'll allow me. Elise studied him for a long moment, then turned her gaze toward Maya. The choice isn't mine anymore, Thomas. It's hers. And in that moment, the fragile balance of the Whitaker empire shifted not in the boardroom, not in the ballroom, but in this small, cramped apartment where love and betrayal collided under the dim glow of a bedside lamp. But, while truth illuminated this fragile space, shadows thickened elsewhere. At the estate, Edward and Cassandra sat in the library, their faces lit by the restless fire. Edward's hand trembled as he swirled the whiskey in his glass, his mind consumed by the image of his father slipping away from him, giving his loyalty to a servant girl. Cassandra, however, looked calm, her smile thin and venomous. You saw it, she said softly, her words cutting like knives. He believes her. He believes that Maid is his daughter. If he announces it publicly, if the world sees her as blood, then everything we fought for is gone. The press will feast on it, a black maid elevated to heir. The shame alone could ruin the legacy, but worse, she have a claim on the fortune. A legitimate claim. Edward's jaw clenched. She's not taking what's mine. I've spent my life carrying this name, protecting this empire while he wallowed in his regrets. I won't let it slip away to her. Cassandra leaned closer, her eyes gleaming like polished steel. Then we cut her out completely, no mistakes. No loose ends permanently? Edward hesitated, the last threads of his conscience tugging at him, but Cassandra's voice slithered through his resistance like poison. This is survival, Edward. Either she disappears or we do. Meanwhile, Maya sat alone that night after Thomas had left, her mother sleeping beside her. She stared at the bracelet on her wrist, the silver compass glinting faintly in the moonlight seeping through the curtains. Her chest ached with conflict. Part of her longed to believe the sincerity in Thomas's eyes, to accept the father she had never known. But another part of her, the part forged in years of struggle and humiliation, screamed against it. She was no one's charity. She had fought too hard to let a man who had abandoned her define her now. Yet as she watched her mother's frail chest rise and fall, she knew Elise wanted her to accept the truth, no matter how bitter. And deep down, beneath the anger, a question pulsed relentlessly in her heart. Could redemption come too late, or was it still worth reaching for? Greed and cruelty-rise winter descended on the city with a sharp bite that cut through streets and alleys, coating the world in a brittle silence broken only by the hum of traffic and the occasional siren. For most, the season meant warmth inside. Homes, fires crackling, families gathering in comfort. But for Maya, it was only another reminder of struggle. Each evening after working long shifts at the Whitaker estate, she returned to her mother in the small apartment where the thin walls could not keep out the cold, where every breath Elise took was heavy with effort, and where the oxygen machine was both a lifeline and a constant reminder that time was slipping away. She carried groceries up the narrow stairs, her arms weary, her legs trembling, but her heart still beating with a stubborn determination. Lately, however, something had shifted because when she opened the door, she often found Thomas Whitaker already inside, sitting at her mother's bedside, spooning soup into Elise's trembling hands or simply sitting in silence, his gaze fixed on the woman he had once loved. Each time, Maya's heart tangled tighter with confusion, anger, and an ache she could not name. She wanted to hate him, But she could not ignore that he came now, that he stayed, that he wept quietly when he thought she wasn't looking, for at least those visits were bittersweet. Her face would brighten when Thomas entered, though her eyes carried the sorrow of knowing time could not be rewound. "You were always stubborn, Thomas," she whispered one evening, her voice fragile but laced with a faint smile. "But perhaps now your stubbornness will save more than just yourself." Thomas had bowed his head, ashamed yet grateful, murmuring that he would not fail her again. Maya, watching from across the room, felt torn between gratitude for the help and fury that it had come too late. She knew better than to believe in promises. Promises had been the poison of her childhood. And yet there was something different about this man now, something raw and human she had never seen in the marble mask of billionaires. But even as the apartment grew warmer with Thomas's presence, Maya knew a storm was gathering far stronger than any comfort he could provide. At the Whitaker estate, Cassandra moved with the grace of a queen sharpening her knives. Her world was built on appearances, and she knew better than anyone how fragile they were. Rumors had begun to spread after the gala, the maid with the bracelet, the strange look in Thomas's eyes, the whispers of illegitimate blood. Society feasted on such tales, but Cassandra was not content with whispers. She wanted destruction. Slipping into her fur-lined coat, she visited the hospital where Elise occasionally received treatments. She entered not as a schemer but as a benefactor, her smile polished, her perfume masking her venom. With discreet donations and quiet words in the right ears, she ensured delays, misplaced files, rescheduled appointments. "Elise William," she murmured to a nurse who owed her a favor, "her treatments can wait? There are far more important patients." The nurse, bound by debt and unable to resist Cassandra's influence, nodded reluctantly. By the time Maya noticed, the damage had already begun. Elise's medications were delayed, her specialist suddenly unavailable. Cassandra left the hospital with a satisfied smile, knowing she had struck at the root of Maya's strength. For if the mother fell, the daughter would crumble. Days later, Maya sat in the clinic waiting room, Elise's medical file clutched tightly in her trembling hands. She had been told once again that treatments weren't available, that her mother's name had slipped down the priority list. Frustration burned in her chest as the receptionist offered nothing but practiced apologies. "This doesn't make sense," Maya argued, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "We've been waiting for weeks." "She doesn't have weeks." But her words fell on deaf ears, the receptionist shrugging with cold detachment. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We'll call when something opens." Maya stormed out, her eyes burning, her chest aching. Outside, she found Thomas waiting in his car. The moment he saw her face, his heart sank. She climbed in, clutching her mother's file, tears streaming. "They delayed her treatment again," she said, her voice breaking. "It's like someone is making sure she doesn't get help." Thomas's jaw tightened, fury igniting in his eyes. "Edward," he muttered, "or Cassandra, they're behind this." Maya shook her head in disbelief, though deep down she knew it was true. She had seen the cruelty in Cassandra's eyes. She had felt it burn across her cheek the night of the gala. "I'll get her the best doctors," Thomas said, his voice fierce. "Money won't be an obstacle this time. I swear it." Maya turned to him, torn between hope and fear. "Then do it quickly, because if we wait, she won't last." But Cassandra was not finished. Words and whispers were her weapons as much as influence, and she wielded them with venomous precision. Rumors began to circulate through the cities. Elite circles. Maya was unstable, they said, a manipulative liar who had ensnared Thomas Whitaker with a fabricated story. Some claimed she had a criminal past. Others whispered about debts, about a sick mother who was nothing but a burden. Within days, the press began to sniff around. Reporters loitered near the diner where Maya worked her second job, waiting with cameras ready. Some shouted questions about the bracelet, about her supposed claim to the Whitaker fortune. Others hurled insults thinly veiled as curiosity. Maya had to take different routes home, ducking through alleys, her heart pounding with fear yet stiffened by defiance. She had been born into struggle, raised in it, and though their weapons were sharper, She refused to let fear define her steps. Still, the weight was heavy, and each night she collapsed into bed beside her mother, whispering reassurances that grew harder to believe. One night, the cruelty took a sharper form. After a long shift, Maya walked home through streets glistening with rain. The hum of an engine shadowed her steps. A black sedan crawled behind her, its headlights cutting through the mist. At first, she ignored it, pulling her coat tighter. But then the sedan surged forward, its tires shrieking as it swerved toward her. She froze for a heartbeat before instinct pulled her sideways. She stumbled onto the rough pavement, scraping her hands as the car swerved, missing her by inches, before vanishing into the night. Her breath came in sharp gasps, fear clawing at her chest as bystanders rushed to her aid. At that exact moment, another car screeched to a halt nearby. Thomas leapt out, his face pale with horror. "Maya!" he cried, rushing to her side. He lifted her trembling body, his hands hovering as though afraid she might shatter. You hurt?" I'm fine," she stammered, though her shaking betrayed her words. "They tried to kill me." Thomas's eyes burned with rage, his arms wrapping around her protectively as though shielding her from the world itself. For the first time, passers-by began to murmur not about a billionaire and a maid, but about a father and daughter standing together in danger's shadow. Later, at the apartment, Elise listened in horror as Maya recounted what had happened. Her frail body trembled with fury and grief. "They won't stop, Maya," she whispered, her voice fragile yet sharp with clarity. "They'll destroy us if it means protecting their greed." Thomas sat at her bedside, his face lined with guilt and determination. "Not if I destroy them first," he said quietly, his voice edged with steel. "I know who did this. Edward and Cassandra will answer for it." Maya turned toward him, fear in her eyes. "If you confront them, they'll deny it. They'll twist the truth and turn it against us. That's what people like them do." Thomas's hand tightened into a fist, his jaw set. "Then I'll shine. Light where they live in shadows. If they think they can erase you, they've underestimated me." Elise's trembling hand reached for his, her gaze steady despite her weakness. "Don't promise vengeance, Thomas. Promise you'll protect her." "That will be enough." At the estate, Edward was pacing, his face pale, his hands trembling with guilt he could not admit. "You nearly hit her," he hissed at Cassandra. "What? If she had died, what if someone saw us?" Cassandra, lounging with her wine, gave a cold smile. "No one saw. And she didn't die. Fear is more powerful than death, Edward. She think twice before stepping near your father again." Edward's eyes darkened, his conscience fraying. "He saw everything," he muttered. "Father was there. He's protecting her now openly. If he takes her side publicly, the board, the company, everything collapses." Cassandra's smile hardened. "Then we take the next step. If we can't break her, we'll break him. His love for her is born of guilt, not reason. We'll poison it, twist it, make him doubt her. A weak heart is easier to break than a strong one." The war for Truth the Whitaker estate shimmered beneath a sky of velvet black, its tall windows glowing with warm light as the city's elite once again prepared to gather for another gala. But inside, the air was taut, tense, as though even the walls knew that the night would not be like the others that had passed in decades of glittering wealth. For Thomas Whitaker, the time of silence had ended. He had spent a lifetime wrapped in steel ambition, locked inside a prison of reputation, allowing greed and fear to dictate his choices. But now, the sight of his daughter nearly crushed under. The wheels of a black sedan, the echo of Elise's trembling voice begging him to protect, not promise, had hardened his resolve into something unshakable. No more whispers. No more shadows. Tonight, the truth would stand on stage beside him. In the days that led to the gala, Thomas moved with an intensity that startled even his most trusted aides. His meetings were cut short, his board calls ended abruptly, and his time was devoted instead to the cramped apartment that had become both a confession booth and a sanctuary. Each evening he arrived with doctors, medicines, and foods Elise had long been denied by the cruelty of Cassandra's quiet sabotage. He sat with her through the night, listening to the wheeze of her breath, to the soft stories of a life that could have been theirs had he chosen differently all those years ago. And always Maya was near, watching him with suspicion, resentment, but also a growing ache of something unfamiliar, the faint flicker of trust. She wanted to push him away. Yet she could not ignore the tenderness in the way he held Elise's hand, or the tears that filled his eyes when her pain was too great. For the first time, the billionaire looked less like a titan of steel and more like a man who had finally discovered his soul, but elsewhere, venom thickened. Edward paced the library with Cassandra perched like a serpent in silk upon the leather sofa, her eyes glittering with anticipation. "He's unraveling," Edward muttered, his voice edged with both fear and rage. "He's spending every hour with them. He's already calling her his daughter. If he announces it—" His words faltered, his throat tight with dread. Cassandra finished them with cruel precision. "If he announces it, then she inherits legitimacy. She becomes more than a maid. She becomes a Whittaker. And when the press hears that your father abandoned a black woman and her child for wealth, when they see him parading her as heir, the scandal will drown this empire. Investors will flee, the board will tear him down, and in the ruins you will be left with nothing." Edward clenched, his fists, his jaw tightening. He had lived his life sharpening himself into an heir, forcing himself to carry annum that weighed like iron. The thought of losing it all to a girl he had once dismissed as invisible was unbearable. "Then we stop him," he said coldly. Cassandra's smile curved, cruel and gleaming. "Yes, but not yet. Let him speak. Let him stand before the city. And then we crush them all with proof, with whispers, with whatever it takes. If the truth is his weapon, we will turn it into his noose." The night of the gala arrived like a storm disguised in silk. Chandeliers glittered above the grand ballroom, violins sang with practiced elegance, and the city's most powerful mingled in anticipation of another display of wealth and philanthropy. But beneath the polished laughter there was an undercurrent, a tension sharp enough to taste. Everyone had heard the whispers. Everyone had seen the tabloids hinting at illegitimate heirs, at scandals hidden in servants' corridors. Tonight they came not just for champagne and charity, but for spectacle, for confirmation of rumors that had shaken the foundations of old money. And Thomas knew it. He had planned for it. Maya stood at the edge of the ballroom, her body trembling inside a gown Thomas had insisted she wear. It was not ostentatious, not one of Cassandra's dripping jewels, but a simple, elegant dress that carried dignity rather than spectacle. She felt small in it, as though the silk could not disguise the fact that she was a maid standing in a lion's den. Yet when Thomas appeared at her side, tall and resolute, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder, something inside her steadied. He looked not like a man attending a gala, but like a soldier walking into battle. Elise sat nearby, her frail body wrapped in a shawl, her eyes filled with both pride and fear. She had insisted on coming, even against Maya's protests, because she knew what this night meant. "I won't leave her to face it alone," Elise had whispered. "This truth belongs to all of us." The orchestra faded and the MC called Thomas to the stage. The crowd hushed, anticipation thick as smoke. He gripped the podium with both hands, his shoulders squared, his face lined with both weariness and determination. For a moment, silence, stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then his voice rang out, deep, commanding, yet trembling with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping over the glittering crowd. For decades, the Whittaker name has been synonymous with power, with wealth, with influence. But a name is more than business. It is legacy. And tonight, I stand before you not as a titan of industry, but as a man who has lived too long in shadows. Tonight I must tell the truth. A ripple of murmurs swept through the hall. Cassandra stiffened, her painted smile faltering. Edward's jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped his chair. Maya's breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. Thomas's eyes found her in the crowd, and his voice grew steadier. "Many years ago, before these walls and this empire, I loved a woman. I made her promises. And when ambition whispered in my ear, I broke them. I left her to bear the weight of my betrayal alone. From that love, a child was born, a child I abandoned, a child who grew in struggle while I lived in abundance. Tonight I confess this to you not out of shame, but out of the need for truth. That child is here. She is my daughter, Maya William. My blood, my family. Gasps erupted through the hall, some shocked, others scandalized. Cameras flashed, whispers hissed like snakes, but Thomas stood unflinching. He extended his hand toward Maya. Come, Maya, stand with me. Maya's legs trembled as though the ground itself resisted her steps. She glanced at her mother, who gave a faint nod, her eyes shimmering with tears. Gathering every ounce of strength, Maya walked toward the stage, the eyes of the world piercing her. The murmurs grew louder, judgment and curiosity swirling like a storm. When she reached the podium, Thomas took her hand firmly, his grip unwavering. From this day forward, he declared, his voice cutting through the chaos, she will never stand in the shadows again. The ballroom erupted. Some clapped politely, others whispered viciously, and a few stormed out in outrage. But no one could deny the spectacle, the most powerful man in the city standing before them, claiming as his daughter the maid they had dismissed as invisible. From the back of the room, Edward surged forward, his voice slicing through the noise. This is madness, he shouted, his face twisted with rage. You're humiliating yourself and this family in front of the entire city. She's not one of us. The crowd turned, eyes wide as the heir of Whitaker Industries publicly confronted his father. Cassandra swept to his side, her crimson gown gleaming like spilled wine, her smile brittle as glass. What proof do you have? She demanded, her voice sharp. A story? A bracelet? This is a circus. Do you expect us to believe a maid's tale without evidence? The murmurs swelled louder, some nodding, others doubting, the tension ready to snap. Then, from the corner of the hall, Elise's frail voice rose, trembling yet unyielding. The proof, she said, standing with the aid of a cane, is in every breath she takes. She is his daughter, she is our truth. The room stilled, the weight of her words pressing down on every heart. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, but his voice rang stronger than ever. If proof is what you want, we will provide it. A DNA test will silence every doubt, but I no longer need science to know what my heart already does. She is mine. The room erupted again, flashes blinding, voices clashing. Some cheered, some condemned, but one thing was certain, the world now knew. And in that revelation, the war for truth had become a war for survival. Redemption or ruin. The morning after the gala dawned with a restless sky, gray clouds rolling over the city as though nature itself sensed the storm that had been unleashed. Headlines blazed from every newsstand, every glowing screen, every whisper that passed between lips in boardrooms and cafes. Billionaire claims Maid as daughter. Whitaker legacy in question? Scandal or redemption? Some papers mocked him, some praised his honesty, but none ignored the spectacle. Maya woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly, reporters demanding interviews, strangers spitting insults, opportunists begging for her story. She silenced it with shaking hands, her chest heavy with dread. Elise sat at the small kitchen table, her frail body trembling with both pride and anger as she skimmed through the headlines. They're scared, Maya, she whispered, her voice cracked but sharp. That's what this is. They're terrified of truth. Maya wanted to believe her, but the weight of the world pressed down too heavily. For the first time, she realized the battle had left the walls of their small apartment. The world now judged her, dissected her life, painted her not as a daughter but as a scandal wrapped in skin too dark for the comfort of old money. Meanwhile, at Whitaker Industries headquarters, the boardroom bristled with panic. 11 men and women, seasoned in the art of power, whispered fiercely as Thomas strode in with Maya at his side. The contrast was striking, he in his sharp suit, his authority commanding, she in modest clothes that carried dignity rather than grandeur, her face pale but her spine unbent. The chairwoman cleared her throat, her voice sharp with worry. Mr. Whitaker, the press is in chaos. Investors are questioning your judgment. This revelation has destabilized our standing. Thomas's eyes narrowed, his voice steady as stone. It is not a revelation, it is the truth. Maya is my daughter. She is family, and family is not a liability. Another board member leaned forward, her eyes cold. With respect, sir, we need proof. Until a DNA test confirms your claim, the company cannot be tied to this circus. Our duty is to protect the empire, not indulge sentiment. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Maya's cheeks burned as though she were on trial, but Thomas placed a hand firmly on her shoulder. You speak of protecting an empire, he said, his voice low but sharp. But what is an empire worth if built on lies? If you question her, you question me. And if you question me, you forget whose name built this empire. The room fell into silence, the weight of his authority suffocating. At last, the chairwoman sighed. Very well. The test will decide. Until then, no public recognition. We must wait, Thomas nodded, but his jaw tightened. He knew what they really wanted was time for Edward and Cassandra to move their pieces, and indeed, across town, Cassandra was already weaving her webs. In front of the mirror of her lavish dressing room, she spoke sweetly into her phone, her lies dripping like honey. Maya William, she told one reporter, is nothing but a manipulative girl who worked here as a maid. Now she spins tailies for fortune. My poor husband is an old man easily swayed by guilt. She saw weakness and exploited it. Each word fueled headlines. Each whisper twisted the story further until Maya was painted as a predator, a schemer clawing at wealth she did not deserve. Edward, however, was less calm. He paced the parlor like a beast caged in glass, his face pale, his hands trembling. If the test proves she's his, he muttered, his voice strangled. Cassandra swirled her wine with cold satisfaction. Then we bury it. Money buys silence, Edward. And if silence fails, fear will do the rest. Edward hesitated, torn between conscience and greed, but Cassandra's smile was merciless. Her weakness is her mother. That woman is the root. Remove her, and Maya collapses. Without Elise, she is nothing but a girl with a bracelet. Edward swallowed hard, but slowly he nodded. The pact was sealed. Days later, the DNA results arrived. The envelope sat heavy in Thomas's trembling hands as he stood in Maya's small kitchen, Elise and Maya watching with bated breath. He broke the seal, his eyes scanning the words that confirmed what his heart had already known, positive, she was his blood. His daughter, tears welled in his eyes, spilling as he whispered, Maya, you are mine. Elise smiled faintly, her face pale, but her eyes shimmering with relief. Maya's chest tightened, tears sliding down her cheeks despite herself. I never asked for this, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never wanted your fortune or your name. All I ever wanted was for her not to suffer alone. Thomas stepped closer, his voice thick. Then let me stand with you now. Let me fight for her, for you, for us. If I must lose everything else, so be it. For the first time, Maya allowed herself to believe him, not as a billionaire, not as a name, but as a father who had finally chosen truth over fear. But as truth cemented, the shadows struck their final blow. That evening, while Maya was at work, Elise's treatment was tampered with. A nurse bribed by Cassandra delayed her medication, and her frail body collapsed into a sudden spiral of weakness. By the time Maya rushed home, Elise was barely breathing, her body trembling as she clutched her daughter's hand. Mama! Maya cried, tears streaming. Thomas arrived moments later, his heart shattering as he saw the woman he had once loved fading before his eyes. Elise's lips trembled as she whispered, Don't weep. The truth is out, that is enough. Her eyes moved to Thomas, filled with sorrow but also forgiveness. You failed me once, Thomas. Do not fail her. Promise me you will protect her. Thomas sank to his knees beside her, gripping her frail hand, tears pouring freely. I swear it, with all I am, I swear. Elise's final breath left her lips like a whisper carried into eternity, and her hand grew still. Maya's sobs filled the room, her body shaking as Thomas pulled her close, holding both his daughter and his grief in one broken embrace. The funeral was quiet. Small, but the press swarmed outside like vultures. Photographs of Maya weeping beside Thomas splashed across front pages, some mocking, others sympathetic. But inside the Whitaker estate, the war exploded. Edward confronted his father in the library, his face twisted with rage. "You've destroyed." "U.S.?" he shouted. "The board is already moving to strip you of power. Investors are fleeing, and for what? For her?" Thomas rose slowly, his eyes blazing with a fire Edward had never seen. "Not for her, for truth. I would rather lose this empire than lose my soul again." Edward's fists clenched, his voice dropping to a growl. "Then you've chosen her over me. You've chosen a servant over your son." Thomas stepped closer, his voice steady, sharp. "No, Edward. I've chosen right over wrong. And that is something you will never understand while you cling to greed and Cassandra's poison." Cassandra swept in, her voice dripping venom. "Do you think society will accept her? A maid, a black girl suddenly paraded as heir? You've sentenced her to ridicule and yourself to ruin." Thomas's gaze turned to steel. "If ruin is the price of truth, then I will pay it." The board voted days later. Edward was given control of the company, Thomas cast aside as too unstable, too distracted, too sentimental. Cassandra smiled like a queen as Edward sat at the head of the table, but her triumph was hollow, for outside the boardroom the public. Tide had begun to shift. The story of Maya and Elise had touched people far more deeply than Cassandra's whispers. News outlets began to frame it not as scandal, but as redemption. A billionaire who confessed his sins. A daughter who fought through poverty and cruelty. A mother who carried dignity to her final breath. Letters of support flooded in from strangers across the country. Voices that had no place in boardrooms but filled the streets with truth. And in that Maya found her strength. Standing beside her father at Elise's grave, she whispered, "They tried to erase us, Mama, but we're still here, and we will not be silenced again." Thomas, stripped of empire but free of lies, looked at his daughter with tears in his eyes. "I cannot give you the years I stole, Maya," he said softly, "but I will give you all the years I have left." For the first time, Maya allowed herself to believe it. She took his hand, not as a servant, not as a scandal, but as a daughter. And though the Whitaker empire fractured, though Edward and Cassandra sat upon its ashes, the true legacy was no longer in steel or money, but in truth, love, and the unbreakable spirit of a girl who had once been invisible and now stood at the center of a story the world would never forget.